is a demonstration for color with an animal. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the color mixing as well as some color temperature as I'm going through this demo. I already have my drawing on my board and I've toned the surface with a very pale green. In fact, I took green and I just kind of wiped it on with a rag, so it's very light. But our resource has a lot of green in it, has a lot of blues. This demo is in oil, so the first layer is going to be thin. I'm going to add a touch of the Walnut Alkyd to my paint. You could also use a Gamblin has a product as well called Galkyd, just something that's going to help dry the paint a little bit quicker. So I'm just going to put it in nice and thin. I'm just going to go in with all my darkest darks. So what I see is being kind of blacks first, and really make sure they're nice and thin. So I'm really scrumbling them in. I can always go back in again later and add more darks on top if I really want to get darker. But I want this first layer to be nice and thin. So just squint your eyes, look at your resource, find all those big darkest darks, and just kind of throw them in. Smooth out your paint strokes if you want to afterwards. Where I'm going in this top area here with all these darks is I've started adding more blue to my blue and brown mixture because I really see the blues in that shadow of the rock behind my penguin. And the darker this is behind him, the more his highlighted areas will really stand out, making him more of the focal point. Plus the blue helps push this all into the background a little bit more because blue is cooler in color temperature than the brown and black and green areas. So it'll just kind of help, hopefully pushing it back, by pushing it back a little bit. And the nice thing about oil is if there is an area that I want to change, after I put the oil in there, I can always just wipe it out with my rag. So I could always take my rag, if there was an area I really wanted to be lighter, I could just wipe it out and then paint over top of it with the lighter value that I needed. So wipe out can be a really helpful tool. Allows me to keep some of those darks in there, but take out some of the areas that I know I'm going to want to be a little bit lighter. So I'll just continue adding more of my darker values and some of my mid-tone values, just kind of getting rid of some of this blank space here really quickly. And this is where I'll still be using some of that fast dry medium for this stage, just to get rid of this background. All of these areas that I painted so far are mixes of the blue and the brown and that fast dry medium, but maybe also a little bit of white as I'm starting to get a little lighter in some of these areas around his face. There's going to be a lot more subtleties going on in here, but for now, and definitely some highlights and such, but for now I'm just kind of getting in some of the grays that I see. Now, there are a few areas in the front of his body that are going to be in shadow, but they're quite light and they have some green in them. So I'm going to start mixing up some of those colors. Underneath the wing, I see it as being a little bit more, maybe like warmer, like brownish, because they're reflected light from the rocks underneath and his fur as well, bouncing up against him. So I'm just going to fill in some of those areas as well. So I'm moving towards this warmer reflected area of the wing. I'm adding a tiny bit of yellow to the color as well as white so that the value gets lighter, but it still feels pretty warm. Now as I start moving into the front of the body for the shadow color, so it's nice and thin, a little bit of fast dry medium, and this is going to be a little bit warmer. I'm going to use the brown and the white. I'm going to add a touch of yellow and blue mixed in because the yellow and blue will make the green, just to help kind of give him the warmth. And there's quite a bit of yellow in that green. I'm just going to have to put it in there and see if it feels right once I get it in there. I don't want it to be too bright green, but I'll have areas of some brighter green and some areas that are a little bit more grayish. So where I see it the most I'm going to put in this green and then go around with some of the grayish tones. So again, that's just more of my brown and my blue. Maybe more brown than blue at this point to kind of warm it up a little bit. And I've got to make sure my value is right. I think this needs to be a little bit lighter actually. So still using that fast dry to help thin it down so it will dry quicker. Now there's going to be some light blue in this area as well, but for now at least I'm just going to take some of this green, kind of mixing in now a little bit of that green and that white and brown to give me this nice warm reflected light on his belly. And just going to get a little darker as I go towards the bottom. I'm still just kind of scrumbling in everything, just really laying it in. I can finesse it a little bit later. With oil, of course, we can just kind of blur areas together as we go. A lot more flexibility that way. And there's going to be a little bit more warm light in this area a little bit later, but for now at least. Now in this area here, I see it being more of a browny, kind of a light grayish shade, so mostly brown, maybe a touch of the blue in with it. That might be too dark, so I'm just going to lighten it up a little bit. It's always that back and forth. And anytime I lighten it up with white, I have to consider if I want it to stay warm, do I need to add a little tiny bit of yellow to it? So coming back in, squinting my eyes, I see, you know, definitely a darker shadow with the brown and the blue mixture underneath that arm or wing. So I'm just going to paint that in there and then wipe off my brush really well. Just kind of make it all work by blurring the edges a little bit. I see some blue highlight up on his chest because it's reflecting the light from the sky. So it's mostly white, a little bit of blue. But I want it to be lighter than what I have there already, or at least the same value. That's a little bit darker, so I got to lighten it up. Sometimes it's a matter of just putting it on there to see if the value is right, and if it's not, lighten it up. Now, there's a lot more going on around my penguin. I could do more detail work in the face, but I want to get some of this stuff around him going first. And so I'm just going to go back to my bigger brush, and I really see these greens. There's some vibrant greens. There's also some blues going on. I'm going to start with some of the more vibrant greens and just paint them in there. Now, I'm kind of going over some of this wet paint, so I'm not using any fast dry medium here. Now it's just paint. It's super thin still, not super thick, but it's not got any of the fast dry medium in it, and that way everything should hopefully dry in the right orders. And then just continue to lighten up some of the colors. Anywhere you see, you know, the greens, like down in here, the greens have more brown in them, and then move into brown. So I'm just going to paint those as I see them there. Now I'm just going to start laying in some of those, what I see as being kind of more grayish tones. Still pretty dark around my little guy. Now in this rock, I'm kind of putting a few different colors. I'm playing around with color a little bit, adding some more yellowy areas, some pinky kind of almost areas where I used a little bit of an orange, that red and yellow mixed together, but all of it has the brown in it, in some places more than others. Just to kind of add a variety of color to this area. Again, I still don't have any of my lightest values, just putting in all these darker values. And then I can scrumble in or even dry brush in, or lay in with my palette knife, however I want to do it, some of those light values at the end. Then I just go in and kind of smooth out, maybe soften up the edge of my shadow a little bit, because I want the shadow to be a little softer. I don't want that to be where the eye goes first, so I want it to be a little bit smoother around the edges. I'm going to be putting in some lights later as well, but for now at least. So I'm just going to continue adding different colors. I think this part up here, where I see his black spots in light, as brown and white in the shadowed area of it. Then it will get more lighter towards the outer edge where the highlight is, and I'll paint that later with a small brush, but for now, just that brown and white, I think. I'm squinting my eyes in here. There's lots of darks. It's kind of neutral. It's not blue and it's not brown, but it's a gray. There's some greenish tones underneath of his chin that I'll paint in as well. And I think I need to go in farther on that background. And that area is really bouncing off the light from the water. So that green, you really do see it in there. I'll add a little bit more of that slightly darker green in here. And you can always use just like mop brushes if you want to smooth out an area after you painted it with oil. You can just go in and lightly feather over and just make a whole area look really smooth. Wipe off that mop brush after you're done with it as well. Okay, I'm going to go in and add some of the mid-tones into some of these areas around my penguin now. And if you need to reestablish any of your blacks, you can go back in. Again, the blacks are just browns and blues mixed together. All right, I'm ready to go into my little penguin's face and start adding a few more details to him, giving him a little bit more character, and just trying to make sure I get some of the color right. I'm really seeing in his muzzle right here some pinky tones, but even that, it's not super pink. It's not just going to be pink out of the tube, like, or red mixed with white on its own. I'm going to mix some of the brown in with it to just dull it. Got some of the white. I'm going to see if my value is right when I put it in. Looks pretty good. I might want to lighten it in an area, but for now at least. I'm just going to soften all these values, soften all the edges, kind of blur them together a little bit more, and then come back in for the final details with a smaller brush. Now I'm just going to go in and start putting in some of the lighter details, and at this point I might need to use my round brush so I can get a finer point on some areas. I could also use a tiny brush too if necessary, but I've made sure I've cleaned off my palette. Now I have no more fast dry medium on my palette, and everything moving forward is just paint. So I'm just going to go in, still working with some of the slightly darker areas of this little guy, and then we'll add the bright highlights on top after. Now the brightest highlights, I want to make sure I have a nice clean brush. And if I don't have a clean brush, I just got to clean off the ones that I've been using. The paint itself will just be pure paint. I might mix in a touch of a yellow, maybe even a tiny bit of brown, so it's not just a pure white yet. And that way I can just go in with pure white later. And of course, I'm going to have to steady my arm. I'm going to take another brush and just go in and start to add in some of those highlights. And every stroke or so, I'm going to have to wipe off my brush because I'm just going to continue to grab some of the wet paint from areas around the places I'm painting in where it's still wet. And underneath his arm, that's really actually quite a warm, almost orangey yellow highlight. So I'm going to go back in there and reestablish that one as a warm orangey highlight instead of just white, because that's what I see. I kind of see some of that color up here too on this side of his little body. Now that I'm looking at his body, on his foot, his left foot, I see some of that kind of pinky orangey tone in the shadows there. So it's kind of a brown and orangey color that I'm mixing together. And I'm just going to use that to create a bit of a highlight along one side of his foot. There are other highlights as well. I see those being a little bit more grayish, maybe even bluish in his foot. And then for the smallest, tiniest little areas, I tend to use a liner brush. So if I have really, like for the eyes, if I have a really light area, I can just go in with a liner brush and hopefully put those in. So I'm just going to mix a black color. And I'm going to have to use this to help steady my hand. But now I'm just going to go through and just start editing any areas that I see that need to be lightened or darkened. Just evaluating what I've done so far and kind of making adjustments to it. Some of those spots on his chest, I wouldn't necessarily go in and make them really dark. I'd just make them light, put them in where I see them. And you can rework it, keep working it until you feel like the piece is finished. Maybe adding a few browns to this blue up in the top to kind of soften some of the cools. You could add more detail into your water, pardon me. Again, darkening or lightening as you see fit. And at the end is when you can really start to add some texture, go in with some thick, goopy areas of paint and really get thick and textured at that end.